Coming up this week on Success Won't Come Calling.
Humans are the most geographically diverse species on the planet. We live in every single ecological niche there is. And the second closest animal is the wolf, which is interesting. If you look at the distribution of different species, the wolf is the second closest. And what do wolves eat? I mean, they're pretty much carnivorous animals as well.
Hello, friends. Simon Gibson here. Welcome to SWCC. Hope you're all well. My guest this week is Dr. Shawn Baker. Shawn is the founder and the world's foremost expert on the carnivore diet. He's an author of a book which is called The Carnivore Diet. He's also a former soldier. He's been a practicing orthopedic surgeon for many years, both in private practice and also in the military. And he's a podcaster, and finally he holds world records in a number of athletic pursuits. I'm really, really proud that Shawn's agreed to come on. He's talking to us from the US today. So welcome, Dr. Shawn Baker.
Hey, well, thank you for that very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to speaking to your audience.
Likewise, Shawn. Did I miss anything out on your resume?
Well, I mean, there's things, but it's not important. I think I did have a stretch as a crazy nuclear weapons guy for a while at some point in my life, which I thought was kind of interesting. But no, that's fine. You've covered it pretty well.
Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, tell me a little bit about, first of all, what the carnivore diet is, and how you first came to adopt it as part of your own lifestyle.
Well, I mean, I guess at its fundamental point, it's kind of people utilize it as a baseline elimination diet to assist with a number of health conditions. You know, it's kind of, I mean, I guess its roots go back into who we are as a human species. We've always kind of been meat eaters, and at some point we probably were close to, if not exclusive meat eaters for certain parts of our existence. And it's something that is clearly something we're anatomically and physiologically well suited to. I adopted it after, just kind of, as you mentioned, I've been an athlete my whole life. I always cared about health and performance. And as I got sort of into my kind of early to mid 40s, I noted that my health was declining despite eating what I thought was generally, a healthy diet as, recommended by most folks. And despite, working out extremely hard, I was still competing at a world-class level. And I was noticing, a number of health issues starting to crop up, which commonly crop up in people's midlife. And I kind of thought at one point, well, that's kind of normal. But then I thought, well, maybe there's something more to this and I should focus on diet more. And so I went through about, 6 or 7 years of experimenting with different dietary strategies. And finally, back in, so we're to 2022 now. So 2016, I stumbled across a group of people that were just eating meat. And I thought that was completely absurd and completely crazy. But it intrigued me enough to say, well, let me just kind of see what's up with these guys. And then I kind of looked at some of their supporting sort of rationale for doing it. And I said, well, I'm just going to try it for a brief period of time. And so I kind of bravely did one carnivore meal and nothing happened to me. And then I kind of extended that. Eventually I ended up doing it for a full 30 days. And that was really transformative for me. I was really shocked at the well-being that it provided me. Things that had bothered me for many years had went away. My digestion normalized for what was the first time I didn't even realize I had abnormal digestion. That quieted down and normalized, things that, aches and pains that I had for, a decade or more went away. So I thought that was really interesting for me. And I kind of did it as a experiment to see how I would react to it, and then found that I kind of like feeling really good. And so call me crazy for that, but I continued with it. I went off the diet for a brief period of time just after the experiment was done, and immediately saw that a lot of the things that were bothering me came right back. And so something in my normal diet was a problem. And so I just trying to keep things simple, I just went back to it and have been on it, for the most part now for almost going on 5.5, years. And so that's what started me doing it. And then, as I've done it and kind of some people noticed that, and I got on some, popular podcasts like, Joe Rogan's podcast, which, is obviously a pretty big platform.
Yeah, absolutely.
We now have, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that have incorporated that very successfully for the most part. So it's been an interesting journey.
Yes, it sounds it. And let's just cover the basics then. So the carnivore diet, as it suggests, focus very much on meat. Is it just meat, or are any other animal-based products permitted under the diet?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to be too dogmatic about it. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, you do what works for you. But most people, as they practice it, particularly early on, if they're trying to eliminate things, will stick to, pure animal products. And the most common one seems to be typically beef, here in the United States. I think there's reasons for that, why that works well. I mean, from a number of reasons, from a nutrition standpoint and from just a evolutionary aspect, but many people will include beef, they'll include eggs, they'll include chicken and seafood and game meats and organ meats and some people dairy. And some people will include a small amount of plant material, particularly like spices and things like that. And many people do just fine with that. There's other people that, are dealing with, complex, very aggressive and severe autoimmune issues, which have to be very strict in the diet. And that seems to be very effective for those types of folks. But yeah, it's something that, is certainly heavily, we don't shy away from eating a lot of red meat, despite, you hear a lot of the warnings on how bad red meat is for people. And
well, I want to come to those because, I mean, they are things that are worth dwelling on. I mean, my interpretation of the science behind some of those studies is there are some areas of that we can probably challenge objectively. But first of all, I mean, we're just going to stick, those of us watching on YouTube, Jacob, we're just going to put up a photo of Shawn. And if you're listening on any of the other platforms, you might want to check it out, man, because I mean, there are always pros and cons of different diets, but Shawn, you're looking pretty jacked, man. Do you mind me asking how old you are?
Yeah, I just turned 55. And so I think that photo was taken, I don't know, about a month ago or something like that. I think something like that. So, I'm hanging in there okay, I guess.
Looking pretty buff, if I do say so myself.
Yeah. Stacey, calm down, will you? For God's sake, she's broken out in a sweat here. Yeah, I mean, just to give you a bit of my own nutritional background, Shawn. I'm a low carb guy. We'll come to that. I followed the ketogenic diet for 2 periods. It didn't work for me, which for reasons that it'd be fun to talk about as part of the chat we have. But I guess just for everyone who doesn't know, the ketogenic diet, I think is probably like 2/3 of the way along to carnivore, insofar as I ate a lot of meat when I was following that, and I still do eat a lot of meat. Very small amounts of carbohydrates in the ketogenic diet, and things like dairy in some moderation. We'll maybe move to the reasons behind these different types of diets shortly, but I suppose the headlines from the carnivore diet, and anyone who reads your book, this will become very clear. No vegetables or very little. You mentioned herbs, obviously, which might have some plant-based elements, but very little fruit is a non-starter, and also no carbohydrates. So let's just talk a little about how we're programmed in terms of the messages we receive from the media in terms of what we should eat, because I guess there's people listening and watching now thinking, what? No vegetables? What about your 5 a day? What about an apple a day keeps the doctor away? How do you sort of resonate the conclusions you've drawn nutritionally with what we've been taught for many, many years along the lines of fruit and vegetables?
Right. So I think that, first of all, I want to say that I don't think fruits and vegetables are poisonous or damaging. I think there's many people that do just fine with them. I don't want to come across saying that you should avoid them at all costs. I do think that there's a number of people where removing those objects from their diet does seem to help, either for a limited period of time or for a longer period of time. And so I think we should be clear about that. I'm not anti-fruit or vegetable. I will say that I think that the benefits of fruits and vegetables are probably oversold. I don't find them to be this magical panacea of health. I don't think that they are certainly more nutritious than meat. I think meat is far more nutritious when it comes to bioavailability, particularly, putting substances that we need in the ratios we need them, particularly things like the amino acids. Meat is not just, protein and fat and a few vitamins and minerals. It's actually, there are 50,000 plus compounds in beef that have been identified, many of which we don't even know what they do yet, but they certainly are important to our overall, health as a species. I think that when we talk about, the 5 a day, that's arbitrary. That just came from somebody who's made it up. I mean, honestly, there's no science behind you need 5 servings of fruit or vegetable. That is completely, largely just a marketing tool. And, when we talk about, why do I feel the way I feel about this? I look at the results people get, and I look at the results people get following the recommended diets. And, people will argue, well, they're not really sticking to the recommended diet. And that's partially true. I mean, a lot of people, most of us are eating ultra processed, basically garbage. I mean, that's 60 to 70% of the United States diet. And I'm sure the UK isn't far from that.
Yeah, definitely. Very similar.
Right. And we see the results of that. And so when I start seeing, people that are getting leaner, they're losing excess body fat, they're ridding themselves of medications, by the basketful, I have to say that, I think that whatever we're doing seems to be working. And if we want to base our decisions making on what actual results people get versus what some organization is telling us to, which is clearly conflicted. I mean, we've seen that probably in very bright light in recent, in the last 2 years. We see a lot of conflict of interest is being displayed, and that's certainly within the nutrition industry. I mean, if we look at things like the Eat Lancet Foundation, where they have this dietary strategy for planetary health, I mean, it's basically processed food. I mean, it's like, eat a sliver, 7 grams of beef a day, which is, it doesn't even fill your thumbnail up. That's what they want you to eat, and then they want you to eat, sugar and grain and soybean oil and all this garbage, which is just basically ingredients for processed food, which benefits these giant, petrochemical and global chemical companies.
Well, let's just, do you mind if we just pause on that, Shawn? Because this seems to me to be a really relevant point in terms of how we've all been programmed, because it's hard not to notice that when we walk into the majority of convenience food-based stores, if that's a coffee shop, if it's somewhere you're at the airport or you're at a railway station, you run into a wall of carbs. And it's a funny one to understand why. A coffee shop, for example, just has layer upon layer of cakes and cookies, sandwiches. And I mean, certainly from the studies I've read, they do suggest that perhaps some decades ago, there was quite a lot of lobbying from the sugar-based fraternity, these companies that you've mentioned, who perhaps wanted to present meat and particularly fat in a light which wasn't consistent with people taking a good view of it. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly that there. I mean, many people are aware of the fact that the sugar industry lobbied Harvard University and paid off their scientists to sort of demonize fat. And that goes back to the 1950s and 60s, I believe. But I think what we see is, why do we see this, and you say carbs, but I mean, in honesty, you see these baked goods and it's carbs, it's fat, it's got all kinds of, it's not just the carbohydrates, it's just the ultra processed foods in there. And what happens is if you eat a meat-based diet, you're just not that hungry and you don't want to eat a lot more. And no one's making money on that. These other companies aren't going to make money if you're not hungry for the biscuits and the chips and stuff like that. They can't sell them to you. So if we say meat is bad for you and you don't eat very much, you're constantly wanting to eat. And so if you just eat a bunch of fruit and vegetables, you're still hungry. I mean, you're still going to want, now I still need to eat that stuff to get my energy from. And I think, when it looks, if you look at the studies, the actual randomized controls trials looking at fruits and vegetables, fruits actually end up being a little bit more healthy than vegetables. If we want to say which one's more healthy to have among that things, and I'm not opposed to people adding things to their diet, but as far as why we're programmed just to eat junk, because it's cheap and it's very profitable, and they want you to buy that stuff, just like a lot of the stuff we end up doing.
And the point you just made there about appetite not being satiated, I find that as well. I mean, I don't eat an awful lot of processed carbohydrates, but definitely if you have a piece of bread or a piece of cake, that doesn't do an awful lot for your hunger. It's not very long before you feel hungry again.
Well, it's interesting, and there's data out there that suggests that adding certain, particularly carbohydrates, actually suppress the satiety hormones, things like cholecystokinin, which has been shown when you add carbohydrates to a protein meal or a fat-based meal, it actually delays that or interferes with that response, which would normally produce a satiety response. And we've all experienced that. You've eaten a big meal, you're stuffed, and you've always got room for dessert. You start eating a little cake, and all of a sudden you can finish the whole cake, and you consume these extra calories, which we've clearly done. I mean, the studies on ultra processed food, Kevin Hall and others have done that, where they show if you're exposed to processed food which contain carbohydrates and often some type of fat in there, you just eat them to excess and you can't stop doing it. And this is what they want. This is what the food manufacturers want. They're not producing food for our health. They're producing food, clearly to make a profit.
For the profit and loss account, absolutely. If so, I suppose the other this issue of programming we could perhaps just touch upon is we're told from early in our lives that the source of vitamins lies in fruit and veg. So, I've always thought, if your vitamin C comes from your oranges and your citrus fruits and that sort of thing. You've obviously followed the carnivore diet for 5 years or so. Do you supplement those sort of vitamins and any minerals?
No, I haven't taken a vitamin in decades. I think they're basically largely kind of a waste, to be honest. The only thing I probably add to my diet that some people might consider a supplement is salt. Which whether that's a supplement or not, I think you could argue about that. But no, I don't. And I've not had any nutritional deficiencies or anything show up. I mean, obviously I'm still functioning. I'm 5+ years in on this, and nothing has showed its head. I mean, early on, I remember people would warn me, "Oh, you're going to get this vitamin deficiency," and then that didn't happen. "Oh, you're going to have this subclinical vitamin deficiency," and none of that seems to have happened. And so I'm like, well, when's this stuff going to kick in? I'm aware of people been doing this diet for now close to 30 years, and none of them have problems with that. So clearly, I mean, you can get vitamins and minerals from plants, and people do that well, but they're harder to access, quite honestly. They're not as bioavailable. I mean, we have difficulty absorbing those things, so you have to eat even more. And also, this is another concept that I think is important to realize, is that what you eat can change the requirements for how much of certain vitamins and minerals you need. For instance, if you eat a diet that is rich in phytates or phytic acid, which would be cereals and grains and legumes and beans and peas and things like that, you need more zinc in your diet because you can't absorb as much, and so you need more zinc. If those things aren't in your diet, you don't need as much zinc. And same thing with magnesium and other different minerals, based on what your baseline diet is. And the RDA has recognized that, but this goes back, we've known this for 100+ years. It's just not common knowledge.
So from your perspective, you're, I guess, living, breathing proof that all of the vitamins and minerals that are needed to sustain not just functionality, but high performance are available from the carnivore diet.
That would be that's my experience. I mean, that is something that, certainly I can point to myself. I mean, there's many other people like me that have done that. And then there's high performance athletes, marathon runners, ultra runners, professional athletes, rugby players, National Football League guys, mixed martial artists that are now doing this and thriving. So it seems to be, you think about it. I mean, when people say I need to include some sort of plants in my diet, I'm like, well, which one is vital for my existence? And then tell me where it grows in every part of the world, in all seasons. And no one has been able to answer that question. I guess maybe you could argue grass, perhaps. Maybe I should be eating grass, but you can't point to a certain berry or fruit or vegetable that grows everywhere throughout the entire planet. And humans are the most geographically diverse species on the planet. I mean, we live in every single ecological niche there is. And the second closest animal is the wolf, which is interesting. If you look at the distribution of different species, the wolf is the second closest. And what do wolves eat? I mean, they're pretty much carnivorous animals as well. So I think meat is complete. I think it gives you everything you need. You might have to eat a certain amount of it. And you can, if you want to make an RDA complete diet, you could argue that seafood and organ meats and things like that. But I'm not convinced you need to do that, quite honestly.
I mean, you don't get much broccoli in the Antarctic, do you?
Probably not. I don't want much of it.
But people still live there and animals still live there. So it's a fair point.
It's an interesting fact about broccoli. Broccoli came to the United States in 1920. It's not something that's been in the human diet for very long. It was invented about 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's not been part of the human diet for very long. And so a lot of these vegetables were just made up. They were cultivated and invented by man. It weren't part of our natural diet. And depending on how long you think humans have been around. I mean, I personally buy into the evolutionary argument, and I think humans, not just Homo sapiens, but humans have been around about 3 million years, and broccoli wasn't part of that diet. It's not to say they wouldn't eat them. I mean, I think clearly we are opportunistic omnivores, but I think we do best on a meat-based diet. I think it's a more effective, more efficient diet. In fact, if we look at species throughout the world, all species that have ever existed on planet Earth, something like 85% of them chose a carnivorous route for their nutrition just because it's more efficient. It's a more efficient way to get food. To be an herbivorous animal, you have to have all these additional adaptations. You look at a cow, they've got, 4-chambered rumen, with all these different stomach or whatever you want to call it. So it's harder to get nutrition from plants. It's not impossible, and humans can do that to some degree, but it's not as efficient. And as a primate, we've lost much of our digestive capacity compared to, like, say, a chimpanzee or gorillas. A great example. Gorillas have to eat a tremendous amount of food. They consume something like 40 to 60 pounds of food every day to support a body habitus, which is not much bigger than a large-sized male human. I eat 3 or 4 pounds a day. I don't have to eat 40 pounds of food, and they spend 80% of their waking hours literally chewing. Human beings spend, and this is some of the interesting anthropologic data looking at early humans based on jaw structure and some of the things they can tell. They thought humans spent about 4% of their time actually eating, which is, and you can't get enough food unless you're consuming animal products to get enough energy with that sort of time frame. So you can choose a plant-based diet, but a lot of people that do these plant-based diets, I mean, they're preparing food, 4 or 5 hours a day. They're eating,
It's not particularly efficient, is it?
No, it's not efficient. It's definitely not efficient.
Did you just say you eat 4 pounds of meat per day?
Yeah, I'd say 3 to 4 pounds. That's pretty consistent. That keeps me kind of where I'm at from a body weight. That's kind of my, and you think about it, that's only 3,500 calories. And for my size and weight, I'm 6'5". I'm 110, 112 kilos, and I'm pretty active. And that's probably consistent with the caloric requirements. Put my numbers into a dietary, calorie calculator. So yeah, that's about what I eat.
Wow. Shawn, our podcast is all about achieving goals and high performance through doing tough things and being prepared to apply discipline and to struggle where we need to and to endure suffering when we need to. I first came across your work when I was, as I mentioned earlier, when I was doing the ketogenic diet. And this was about 3 years ago, and I stuck at it for about a year. I have to say I was in definitely the best shape I'd ever been. But I personally found it unsustainable. Perhaps I could just tell you the reasons why I found it unsustainable, and you could give me some feedback on whether carnivore diet provides any solutions to these. Is that okay?
Absolutely, sure.
I found ketogenic diet a little bit stressful because, just to explain what the ketogenic diet is, the body, as Shawn has alluded to, it runs on energy. So you need energy, and then there are 2 principal forms of energy. The first is fat, and the second is glucose. And basically, as I understand it, your body converts anything that isn't fat into glucose and uses that for its primary energy source. And what the ketogenic diet does is, by cutting the majority of carbohydrates out of your diet and keeping your proteins to moderate, it means that your body is compelled to burn fat as its energy source. So it means that if you're looking to lose weight, for one example, that your body has basically no option but to attack your fat stores and to process fat more efficiently than it would have done if you're faced with a diet which blends carbohydrates, vegetables, and proteins, which your body turns into glucose with fat. Shawn, is that scientifically a fair summary of what ketogenic diet is?
I think really the goal of ketogenic diet is to be in ketosis, which means, you are, like you said, choosing to utilize a fat as a primary fuel source, or ketones to be more accurate than you are glucose. But, your body will turn protein and fat into glucose when needed. And that's why, you can survive on a carnivore diet. But the ketogenic diet often is a high fat diet, and that's where some of the criticism comes in. Many people will find, like you said, it's one of those things where people are constantly measuring if they're in ketosis or not, which can produce a lot of anxiety for people, because sometimes they're not, and they don't know why, and they've been doing the same thing they did yesterday, but now they're not in ketosis, so it stresses them out. And that's one of the things that just with a carnivore diet, I don't really care whether I'm in ketosis or not. I don't worry about that. All I care about is how I'm, at the end of the day, how I feel, and ideally maybe what the body composition is. That's more of a concern to me.
Because if you're on a ketogenic diet, low carb, high fat, and you're not in ketosis, then I suppose the principle is that something's not quite working in terms of the way you're combining your nutrition. The story I always tell Shawn, which persuaded me that the ketogenic diet wasn't for me, is that I was measuring every day whether I was in ketosis, not through bloods, but through urine strips. And I can remember one time that I'd had some chicken and a couple of cups of spinach. And I did my ketosis test, and the spinach had knocked me quite some distance out of ketosis. And I just thought, oh my God, life's too short for this. I'm getting all in a bit of a tiz about having too much spinach. It's not rock and roll, is it really?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that people have to realize, particularly like the urine strips tend to be not particularly accurate. There's also, when you first go into ketosis, you're very inefficient at using ketones, and so you have higher levels. But as time goes by, even people, most people that are on a ketogenic diet for long periods of time don't actually produce much ketones because they're utilizing them. So now there's always a balance between how much you waste, how much you produce, and how much you're actually using. And so if you're very efficient at it, you'll produce just enough and use just enough, and you won't waste much. So you won't really see a lot of ketones floating in your bloodstream. And so you could still be on a quote unquote ketogenic diet, but not making as many ketones as you once did. And so that's a concept that a lot of people don't seem to realize, and they get too hung up on it. And so what do? They just start eating more fat. And so they're like, I better eat more butter or something like that. And that actually is probably a net negative for folks when they try to just, sort of gain, because your body is very good at homeostasis. It likes to run at a certain temperature and a certain pH and a certain fuel mixture. And so it's good at, sort of utilizing what it needs to do to sort of normalize things. And so if you keep trying to push it one way or the other, you can sometimes, shoot yourself in the foot, so to speak.
Yeah. And the impression that I got from what you were saying earlier, Shawn, was that let's flip back to the carnivore diet, and we might make some comparisons with the ketogenic diet as we go along the way. But the big benefits, I'm still quite a low carb guy. I don't have a lot of pasta or bread or rice. I'll have vegetables. I have some dairy, and my vice is beer, unfortunately, which we might touch upon in a little while. But there's no doubt that when you drop your carbs, you do see weight come off, certainly on the scales. We might touch upon whether that is proper fat burning, but from a carnivore diet perspective, is weight loss one of the real benefits you would identify?
A lot of people lose weight. Absolutely. I'd say probably a majority of people, particularly if they're starting out overweight, the majority of people seem to lose weight. There's some people that don't, and there's various reasons for that. I think, initially, as you might point out, kind of alluded to, initially you lose water. So water weight is lost initially for many people when they drop carbohydrates. And there's simple physiology for that. Your kidneys just don't hang on to as much salt, sodium, and water when you go on a low carb because of the effect of basically lowering the amount of circulating insulin you're exposed to. But yes, many people do lose weight. I think that one of the problems with the ketogenic diet, as practiced by many people, in my view, is it just doesn't contain enough protein. I think protein is something, if you go on a carnivore diet, you're going to be on a high protein diet relative to everybody else. The average person in the US, and I'm sure the UK is very similar, is about 15% of your dietary calories are coming from protein. And I think humans probably evolved, probably in a space where probably they were getting closer to 30% of their calories from protein. So I think we're more adapted to higher protein diets, and it's very easy to do that on a meat-based diet. You can certainly up your protein, taking protein powders and, mixing up soybeans and things like that. But that's probably not how, again, I hate to always point to humans and historically, but historically humans were not eating protein bars and they were not grinding up tofu patties and making that. That's not what we did. We were doing what was obvious and eating animals, and that's where we got most of our protein from. And that's what makes sense to do, even thousands of years later.
Absolutely. I mean, it was one of the things which was stressing me out about the ketogenic diet was this idea that you had to cap your protein. So I'd be planning my meals out. I'd say I'll have a nice big ribeye for lunch and then maybe some rotisserie chicken for dinner. I'd look at my macros and they looked absolutely dreadful. There wasn't enough fat. There was too much protein. And I just thought, well, you didn't, as you've mentioned the evolutionary perspective, but you didn't have cavemen with MyFitnessPal, did you?
I don't believe so. Unless there were aliens, it would help them. Maybe aliens helped them. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question, which I think is going to be on a number of our listeners and viewers' minds, Shawn. Can you be on the carnivore diet and cheat? So can you be a guy who follows the carnivore diet and has a few beers at the weekend, maybe has a pizza once a week? How strict have you got to be in order to gain the benefits from the carnivore diet?
There's people that do that all the time. I've got data on, we did some research on 12,000 people doing this diet. And, as we saw the level of compliance, we looked at people from 70% of their diet was carnivore, 80%, 90%, 100%. There was a linear increase in the outcomes, better outcomes as you got closer to 100%. But the difference between 90% and 100% wasn't giant. Between 70 and 80 was a pretty big difference. From 80 to 90 was a decent difference. When you got 90% or better, the difference wasn't that extensive for an overall general population. So yeah, there's a lot of people that are 90% carnivore, and that's totally fine. What that 10% consists of is going to have some influence on it. If you're carnivore plus 10% candy, you're probably going to do worse than if you did carnivore plus 10%, whole food type things. I think it depends also on the condition you're treating. If you're treating some sort of like Crohn's disease or some other really aggressive inflammatory autoimmune disease, you're probably going to want to not do the cheating, But if you're just a regular dude that's like, hey, I just want to lose, 10, 20 pounds, that's probably very reasonable. And, and to say that you can't do it without being perfectly strict would be, one, it would be inaccurate, but it's also, I'm not particularly dogmatic about this. I'm at the end of the day, I'm like, well, let's see what works. And in fact, if you don't mind, I'll mention the company we have now.
Please do. I want to talk about Revero. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So we are implementing AI to help figure out for particular disease states. Let's say you have somebody that has, let's say ulcerative colitis or diabetes. They're going to probably have different nutritional requirements based on one, their disease category, but also on their demographics, who they are, how old they are, what other issues they're dealing with, what their activity level is, where they live, and on and on and on. And so we're able to use AI to sort of say, these foods are likely to be problematic for you based on all the thousands of other people that have similar situations to you. And we can start making recommendations. And so maybe you don't need to go on a full carnivore diet. Some people might need to do it as a baseline elimination. And then they can reintroduce these various foods that are deemed to be relatively safe and avoid the ones that seem to be more problematic. Now, I can tell you much of the processed food junk diet is not going to be helpful for really anybody. And if you decide, like if you say, hey, and I do this occasionally, I've never sit there and said, I'm only going to eat meat for the rest of my life. I've always said, I don't know, maybe I'll change my mind. I'll go whatever makes me feel best. And from time to time, I will have, something that's not on the diet. Like I said, I'll have a piece of birthday cake on my child's birthday, and I don't really worry about it. It's because it's so infrequent. But I mean, I don't, like I said, my results are what they are. Some people will say that, I'm on death's door and I look like I'm going to die. And other people, I get that from vegans all the time, which I find humorous. And other people will say, hey, look, you look like you're doing pretty well. And, my view is I'm doing pretty well with that. So, yeah, I mean, you can certainly do a, modified carnivore diet and have success with that. But sometimes, you just have to be objective about what kind of results you're achieving. And if the one beer on the weekend at the pub turns into 6 beers every night,
that's probably too much.
Probably too much, right?
I think there's a number of reasons why that would be too much, no matter what diet you're following. But I mean, sure. Let's just touch on your business is Revero Health. You're founder and chief executive of that company. So if you were to, you mentioned the AI that you guys are developing. Just tell me a bit more about what Revero is and what your mission is.
Right. Well, I mean, as of this point, we've been an online digital community. We just basically been helping people using primarily a carnivore-based diet. But we've seen that, one, not everybody needs to do it. Two, not everybody's willing to do that for the long term. And it's, it may not be sustainable for all people. So we want to figure out what are other potential approaches to this. And so while we're still very heavily meat-based in our nutritional requirements or recommendations, we are using, like we said, AI to solve these issues. So there will be a particular diet for a particular person with a particular disease process based on the data that we've collected and we continue to collect, and that AI will continue to adapt. So as we get more data from more people, we're able to continue to refine our recommendations. My co-founder is an AI, machine learning specialist, AI engineer out of Silicon Valley, and we have, meticulously collected data over the last several years. We're going to be doing some clinical trials, on the carnivore diet and then subsequently on the AI-based diets. And so we are in the process of raising several $1 million in that regard. And so that's going well with us. And so, and we will be hiring physicians, and there will be a full medical company that will do that. And we will, be an alternative to the, kind of the standard healthcare system, which I think is largely been very inefficient at the best, I can say with that. I mean, it's much, particularly in the United States where we spend, $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare, and our results are, I don't think anyone would disagree that our healthcare results are not particularly good.
Well, do you know what, Shawn? I mean, obviously the US healthcare system has its critics. I mean, I can't say that we do anything particularly better here in the UK. As you'll know, we have a national health service here. But when I talk to American friends and business contacts, we have a lot of the same problems in terms of efficient management, in terms of utilization of technology, in terms of applying up-to-date bespoke science to particular problems. I think it's very much a cattle-based approach to healthcare. So I'm just not sure that there's a lot of difference between the US and the UK models. And I do think we need, for those who can access it, the most cutting edge and the most appropriate approach to healthcare. It sounds to me like Revero are really positioning themselves so as to provide that sort of service.
Yeah, I think that's going to be, I mean, and we're not alone in this space. There's a number of companies. We look at, we're doing our due diligence. We're looking at the number of people that are entering this space in various different forms. There's a lot of that. And there's a lot of money going into that. And it will continue to be. I think people are looking for better alternatives. I think the allopathic system, both NHS and the United States system, you've got a nationalized one payer system, I think, for the most part. And I mean, they're still under the same paradigm. We're still like chasing our tails. It's like we don't really prevent disease. We don't really cure disease. All we do is throw some drugs at things and, maybe do a few procedures. And, there is some good that's done with that, but it's, we don't really talk about getting people off their medications, deprescribing, and actually curing things, which I think is very doable. I mean, many of these lifestyle diseases are just a matter of fixing the lifestyle issues. And until we're willing to fully embrace that, not just give it lip service and just kind of have it be a little blurb in your talk. Every time you go to a medical talk, they'll spend like 20 seconds talking about losing weight, lifestyle, and then the next hour is presented on all the different drug variations and options you can utilize. And so I think the emphasis is in the wrong place. I mean, we measure the wrong things, we care about the wrong things, and until we start doing the right things, people are going to continue where they're at.
And there's a chance, isn't there, that we mentioned this issue of profit earlier, because the reality is, I mean, let's look at the situation we're in at the moment with COVID and these vaccines. And I mean, I'm vaccinated. I'm not particularly pro or anti-vaccine, but the fact is that there's not much profit to be made in telling people to drink more water and to exercise more and to look at what they eat and to get 8 hours sleep a night. There's not that much profit in that personal agency, is there? Do you think that comes into the approach to healthcare everywhere?
Sure. I think obviously, a hospital CEO has to pay the bills. They have to run the lights, they have to pay their employees, so they have to be profitable. And I know personally, and this is one of the things that kind of jaded me a little bit on the healthcare system, is how much that drives their decision making. Again, they're in that situation for a reason. The pharmaceutical companies, they want to make money. And, it was interesting. I remember I saw an article from Goldman Sachs talking about, is curing disease a sustainable business model? And the answer was no, it's not. So there's no incentive to cure diseases from the pharmaceutical side. It's just to manage those diseases, manage those symptoms, and, procure customers for life. And so, yes, there's a lot of profit about that. Now, can there be profit, or can there be a financial benefit for dealing with lifestyle? I think strongly, yes, there is. Now, it's not going to benefit the pharmaceutical companies. It's not going to benefit the healthcare industry, but who it does benefit largely are employers that are having to pay these enormous amounts of money to provide healthcare for their employees. And so if you can go to Ford Motor Company, Boeing, or one of these big corporations, say, look, we can save, X amount of millions of dollars annually for you by actually treating disease and reversing disease, there is going to be some finance. So it's going to take the money from the pharmaceutical industry and move it over to these other companies that are actually maybe, and who knows who's better or not. They're all wanting to make profit or to cut their costs down. But I mean, you can shift the money around. It's kind of a zero-sum game. But obviously, the pharmaceutical companies would rather the money stay in their pockets and rather than it going to another company. And then, of course, there's the side effect, or the most important part is the actual person themselves is no longer, saddled with these diseases and these, poor quality of life due to those things. And so that's, I think maybe it's more noble to do it that way. I mean, I guess time will decide and society will decide.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, it sounds as if there's more money in treating sick people than to stop people getting sick. But as you said, there's more to it all than money. Let me just ask you a couple of questions, Shawn, on the benefits of the carnivore diet. We've got lots of business owners who listen in and watch these podcasts, and obviously you and I are business owners. In terms of cognitive benefits of the carnivore diet, things like decision making, memory, that sort of thing. Have you been able to identify, and perhaps more importantly, is the data and studies to back up any cognitive benefits that the carnivore diet has?
Well, as I said, the studies on a carnivore diet, there's few and far between. There's only been about, a dozen studies in the literature that have looked at specifically at a carnivore diet. Every one of those studies, by the way, has been very positive. There's, people are saying it's dangerous and it's bad. I'm saying, well, there's no studies that show that. And the only studies on the carnivore diet have been, very, very much to the positive. There are studies on carbohydrate restriction and ketogenic diets, which share some similar physiology with a carnivorous diet with regard to cognitive health. We've seen a lot of people that are actually treating dementia patients with a ketogenic style diet. There are, like I said, a number of studies that show improvements. Now, anecdotally, I've got a lot of evidence of people saying, yes, I don't have quote unquote brain fog, whatever that nebulous term means, but they can think more clearly. They feel more productive. I see a lot of people where their mood is elevated, and so that goes into cognition. I see a lot of people. The other thing I see a lot of people, which has very been surprising to me, at least early on, was a lot of people are able to quit addictive behaviors, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or some people it's coffee or illicit drugs. And so all those things go into cognitive, function and performance. And so I'd say probably yes. And I think good nutrition, I think just good nutrition in general, just like it improves your body composition, the health of your liver, the health of your heart, it improves the health of your brain, which again, cognition is part of what our brain does for us, right?
Yeah, I mean, is that purely anecdotal, Shawn? Because I'm really interested in this issue of helping with addiction. Because surely are those smoking, drinking too much, illicit drugs, isn't that a dopamine release issue? Are you saying that the carnivorous diet actually helps regulate or modify the brain's production of dopamine?
Well, it's going to be multifactorial for sure. I mean, there's a number of things that are happening with addiction that happen within our brain physiology. There's literally 1,000 things that are going on. One of those is, I think this is something that, and I've talked to people that are addicts, and I've talked to people that have been using dietary strategies within their field of addiction medicine, and they are seeing that. The few that use it, Chris Palmer, Harvard University, has seen improvements in mental health diseases like schizophrenia, but also with addiction with this. And so I think one of the things I see is, if we're on a carbohydrate-based diet, we have pretty rapid and sort of large fluctuations in blood glucose and energy. A lot of us have seen, when we eat, we get our energy back, and then we crash and we're up and down all the time. And that has an impact on the brain's physiology. And so I think some of the same physiology is occurring with a cigarette, a hit of a cigarette.
I see. Yeah.
Tickling the same nerve. And so so one of the things that I always thought was kind of surprising is, you go into a rehab center to quit whatever, alcohol, drugs, heroin, something like that, and they feed you complete garbage. And so you're continuing to, trade one sort of, dopamine rush or some other physiological change for another thing. And so you're just kind of you're quitting your cigarettes, but you're eating chocolate, and the trade-off is not ultimately helpful for you. And so you have to just
to keep going down this road. Sorry to cut you off, Shawn. This dopamine rush, I mean, presumably if you're following a carnivorous diet and a healthy lifestyle, you still get a release of dopamine. Are you saying that if you see a ribeye and your brain releases a dopamine rush, that it's not the dopamine that's the issue, it's what's giving you the rush? So if you have a ribeye, if you buy into the principle that that's doing you good, then that's a much better option than a shot of heroin or a cigarette or a cream cake.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly that aspect. I think that you can't say that dopamine rush is what addicts have, and therefore all dopamine is bad. I mean, all these things, whether it's glucose or insulin, we need all of those to happen. That's part of who we are. And so the answer is not zero. It's, what's the normal amount. And so if I'm, and again, I'll just kind of go back to food. If I'm having to eat every 3 hours or 2 hours or every 15 minutes to get a little rush of, some sort of pleasure from eating, that's going to have a negative consequence that I eat too much. Now, if I can, eat, like when I eat a ribeye steak, and I had a New York strip before I started this a little while ago, it was a very pleasurable experience to me. I felt pleasure eating that. It gave me happiness and joy, and I feel good. But I'm only going to do that once or twice a day because I'm not hungry anymore. And it's done. It's not only has it provided me that stimulation, that happiness, but it's also filled me up. And so now I'm satiated. I won't need to do that. Now, if I had just eaten a little chocolate bar, I would still be hungry in about 15, 30 minutes or an hour. And I'd want to do it again and continue to do that. And we have people.
I've got you. So because you're still hungry, you go after the other chocolate bar. That's interesting. Can the carnivorous diet help with sleep?
Yes, it often does. We see people improve their sleep. I think there's some studies. Again, I use some of the other literature. There's studies on really low carbohydrate diets and stage 4 deep sleep. and they see
Dream
that's
sleep.
increased.
Yeah.
So it's not the REM sleep. It's a really deep state sleep, and that seems to have a more restorative property. So a lot of people will go on a carnivore diet and they'll say they slept really well, and they just feel better restoration. Now, what I often see is people tend to even need a little less sleep on a carnivore diet. Instead of 8 hours, they can get by with 6.5 hours. And that's what I typically do. I usually end up about 6.5 hours. I go to bed at, maybe 11 p.m. and I wake up at 5:30 with the sun. And I feel great. I'm able to do my daily activities, able to train pretty hard. And I think one of the things that we see is on a meat-based diet, you develop a little bit less of this oxidative stress that you have on a higher carb diet, because it's kind of a different fuel system that requires a little bit more reduction or antioxidant utilization. So when you're not beating yourself up as much metabolically, you have to do less at night to recover from that. And I see that a lot with athletes.
Are there any studies which support that, Shawn? Because 6 hours. 6.5 hours. I'm sure that does work for you. And it's clear that it does because you're in phenomenal shape. But that seems to go against a lot of the things I've heard in the past. Are there studies which really back that up in terms of the carnivore diet reducing this sleep requirement?
So there are, what I would say is there's studies on oxidative stress and high carb diets. Those have been done. I think Jeff Bullock and Stephen Finney have done that on athletes. So we know that you have a lessened amount of oxidation to deal with. And when you deal with that is during your sleep period, and that's pretty clear as well. There's no study specifically on a carnivore diet. Again, this is something, getting these studies done is very challenging and expensive, and nobody wants to pay for it. That's why one of the reasons we are fundraising, so we can do some of these studies. Now, we're not going to focus on sleep as our primary endpoints, because that's, we've got other questions we'd like to answer. But, there are a number of sleep studies that's showing that, what's the optimal amount of sleep. And certainly, longevity is tied into how long you sleep, and people that sleep a little bit longer, but not too long, tend to do better. But again, we have to look at the context of what diet that's on. That's typically, if you're on a standard American diet, which most people are, you need 8 hours of sleep, right? Because there's things you need to do during your sleep. And some of that has to do with you being beat up metabolically. If you're not on a standard American diet and you're eating a healthier diet, maybe you can get by with less sleep. I don't know. That's still conjecture on my part. Yeah. I can just say that I function well on less sleep than I needed when I was eating a more mixed diet. And many people also comment on that. So whether that turns out to be a long-term benefit or a detriment, we won't know. And may never know, quite honestly.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's early days, but good reasons for optimism. Let's play devil's advocate for a minute, just in terms of the couple of the potential downsides. Again, this is just things I've read. Obviously, there was the Game Changers documentary on Netflix a few years ago. That's been challenged quite robustly by a number of people in the carnivore community, as it were. A couple of things, I suppose. First of all, I think it's right to say that a heavily meat-based diet can produce an increase in amino acids, which have been linked to an increased cancer risk, particularly colon cancer. What do you say to that? First of all, I guess, do you agree that it's linked with a carnivore diet can be linked with an increased amino acids? And secondly, does that necessarily follow that there are increased risks of cancer, and particularly colon cancer?
Well, again, we don't have any studies on the carnivore diet to support or disprove that, but I certainly think it's plausible that there are going to be more amino acids circulating in your blood on a carnivorous diet. And higher protein diets have been shown to show that. One of the relationships with there's something called branched chain amino acidemia, which is high amounts of things like leucine, isoleucine, and some of the other branched chain amino acids being associated with diabetes. Now, what we're seeing is probably that's reverse causality. People that are diabetic break down their own muscle tissue, and therefore they have higher serum levels of amino acidemia. So that's probably not a problem. Now, when you're talking about what causes colorectal cancer, which is one of the things that, for instance, in 2015, the World Health Organization, via the IARC in Lyon, France, declared red meat to be a class 2 carcinogen and processed meats to be class 1 carcinogen. So that data was almost purely based on epidemiologic studies, which are not particularly instructive for informing decisions. They also had they had about 4 or 5 animal studies, which also, again, did not actually demonstrate cancer progression or cancer in humans, just precancerous situations in rats that were genetically modified to show cancer, were fed sugar in their diet with some amount of meat, and also given a cancer promoting drug. And so it's not really a particularly good human model for that. So on that panel was a guy named Professor David Clearfield, who informed me that he said, look, this panel in France was, number one, they threw out all of the evidence. They refused to consider evidence that showed that red meat was not carcinogenic. It was not a consensus statement. There were many dissenters in that group. Also, a number of members on that panel were vegetarian, vegans, and Seventh-day Adventists who are religiously sort of aligned with veganism or vegetarianism. They failed to disclose that in their research. Beyond that, there have been a number of studies that have come out subsequently. One in particular, the 2019 Nutrirex article that consisted of 14 authors from around the world, looking critically. It was the largest review of red meat ever been done. And also, one of the senior authors on that was Gordon Guyatt. Gordon Guyatt, a professor of medicine at McMaster's. I think he's at McMaster's in Canada. One of the world's leading authorities on evidence-based medicine. He, in fact, invented that actual term, evidence-based medicine, back in a 1991 single-author paper. And their conclusion of that study, looking at all of the literature and trying to hold it to the highest level of quality of evidence, basically concluded that red meat has no strong evidence whatsoever that it causes cancer, heart disease, or any other diseases that it's been accused of. And so, the evidence is just incredibly weak that supports that. Now, there is, like I said, there are people that like that particular message, whether they are plant-based advocates, whether they own fake meat companies. There's a lot of media propaganda that's being used to support that assumption. But, if you look at, for instance, the epidemiologic data, and again, I always put the caveat, the epidemiology is not the best source, but if we want to say,
Shawn, do you mind if I just quickly tell everyone what an epidemiological study is, and how, for everyone who's watching and listening, the problem with, as I understand it, with epidemiological studies is that the subjects of the study, so for example, if you're undertaking research to assess the impact of red meat upon well-being, and the conclusion is drawn that a certain percentage of people who eat red meat 5 times a week suffer with a particular type of cancer, unless you isolate your audience to rule out the fact that they might be heavy drinkers, they might be smokers, they might not exercise, they might actually be eating hot dogs on white hot dog buns and cheeseburgers, then you're at risk of running some to arriving at some very skewed conclusions. Whereas if you do isolate the audience that you're comparing like with like, you get a much better chance in, I think, what I would think of as a randomized controlled trial than you would in an epidemiological study. Is that right, Shawn?
Right. So in an epidemiological study, there's a healthy user bias. So just by telling people, like I was going to make this point in Asia. So I've grown up with a message that red meat's been bad for me. You've probably heard the same. So if you continue to eat meat, many people say, well, I don't really care about my health, and I'm just going to not engage in other healthy behaviors like exercise, wearing my seatbelt, getting a physician visit, or any of those things, smoking, so on and so forth. In Asia, red meat people have not heard that red meat is bad for them in Asia, or at least traditionally they have not. Now, maybe that message is being mixed a little bit today. And they consider red meat a sign of wealth and a sign of prosperity. And so what we see is when we look at the Asian epidemiologic studies, there's no association between red meat and colorectal cancer. In fact, there's also often negative associations where it actually shows a better outcome. And so when we talk about quality and strength of evidence, a randomized control trial is better. And there are zero randomized control trials that show red meat causes any disease. And so this is an important concept. So this epidemiology allows you to generate a hypothesis and say, well, we've got some associations here. Now, the problem is, when I ask you, what did you eat for the last year? You're not going to really remember it. You're not going to remember that.
You're probably not going to say what you have as well.
Right. And this is the data that they're using to base these assumptions on. So they have poor recollection, or people, kind of fudging what they answered. to make conclusions, and they have very low relative risk. It's like a 1.2 hazard ratio or a 20% increase, which is on terms of statistical significance, it's basically nothing. When we looked at the epidemiology that showed that smoking was linked to lung cancer, it wasn't a 20% increase. It was a 2,000 or a 3,000 fold increase.
So that's pretty conclusive, isn't it? Yeah.
That's really conclusive. So you don't need the randomized control trial. But when you're showing red meat, like the World Health Organization said, 17% increase in colorectal cancer, that is tiny. That's a 1% absolute risk increase, which is something also people need to be familiar with.
Yeah.
What is the difference between relative risk and absolute risk? And so it's a minor increase, and it's based on really, really weak evidence. And so if I want to say if I'm going to avoid colorectal cancer, I would say don't be fat, because that has a much stronger association. It's like a 300% increase rather than a 17% increase. Don't have a lot of visceral fat. Don't have a lot of chronic inflammation. Don't have GI issues like Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome. All of those factors which I mentioned get better on a carnivore diet.
And don't smoke. Don't smoke, drink lots of water, don't take drugs, get some exercise.
Right. No.
Yeah, it makes total sense, doesn't it? I think that's some of the messaging which maybe is right. Final question from me, Shawn, because I know I've got to let you go. Let's move away from nutrition and just let me challenge you on some of the non-nutritional potential risks of the carnivore diet. I mean, let's think about animal welfare first of all. I mean, if I'm a big meat eater. You obviously are. If we encourage this and if we promote the benefits of a carnivorous diet, which you've been very eloquent to do today and very persuasive, aren't we in a situation here where things like the unethical farming practices and animal raising practices that we hear all about are just going to be escalated and extrapolated? Are you worried about that?
Well, again, do I think the whole world is going to go on a carnivore diet? Absolutely not. I think it's a straw man argument, first of all, just to say that. I don't think anyone's going to, there's going to be one diet for the world, unless the only one diet for the world would be maybe some bug protein bars that the world forces us to do down the road. But I mean, as far as, getting the whole world on a vegan diet or a carnivore diet or a Mediterranean diet, it's not going to happen. But if we want to run that scenario and say we want to just say we're going to increase our meat consumption rather than decrease, and the goal is maybe we can improve population health that way. And some people would challenge that assumption. I think it's probably a valid assumption. But, you have to look at animal agriculture practices around the world. And, if we want to say, animals are being abused and tortured, first of all, that is the exception, not the rule. If you spent any time and talked to ranchers and farmers or actually in the industry, they find that abhorrent to themselves. None of them support that. They take tremendous care of the livestock they have, particularly when it comes to like beef for cattle and dairy cows. I mean, I know a lot of these guys. I've been to their ranches. I talk to them, I interact with these folks on a fairly frequent basis. And it makes no sense to them to have a sick, abused, tortured animal. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't help them financially. It doesn't help them in any way, shape, or form. And so they do everything they can to ensure those animals have the best quality of life they possibly can. A cow in the wild is not going to live 12 months. It's going to be eaten and torn apart by predators. A cow on a dairy farm is going to live 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 years in many cases. Beef cattle usually meet their demise at about 2 years. But still, that's still far longer than nature would give them in most cases. There's a study out of Pennsylvania looking at deer populations, and they basically tagged all these baby deer and they followed them for as long as it took. And they found that over approximately 50% of the deer were killed before they reached 30 weeks of age. They were killed by animals and predators. And so the issue in the wild is, these animals are not being abused and tortured like plant-based people would tell you, particularly when it comes to like beef is something I consume. And I think it's probably the top on the nutrition scale. Now, the other thing that's important is to realize that throughout the world, there are different levels of efficiency. In the United States, in the UK, in Australia, we've gotten very nutritious about how we breed cattle, how we feed cattle, how we manage cattle, how we protect them from predators, how we time and manage those. So we've become very efficient. In places like India, which India has the world's largest beef herd. They've got 250 million head of cattle. For put that to contrast, the United States, we have about 95. In the UK, I think you have something like 15 million head or something like that. I'm not sure the exact number in the UK. But so India's got the largest herd of cattle in the world. They are probably 20 times less efficient when it comes to like milk production, meat production, just because the animals are so poorly mismanaged there. They're roaming the streets, they're eating garbage, they're not taken care of. Many of them are infested with parasites, so they can't keep on weight. And so if we just were to bring up the level of knowledge to the 1950s with worldwide cattle production, we could almost, increase our production by like 40 or 50% worldwide just by improving what we already have. That's not to mention the fact that, say, for instance, in the United States, in 1975 or so, we had 130 million head of cattle. We only have 95 million head of cattle today. We've decreased the cattle herd population in the United States by 40%. And worldwide, it's gone down as well. Worldwide in the 1980s, it was like 1.3 billion cattle. Now it's like 1.1 billion. So we've lost 200 million cattle in the world. And so, there's people that are talking about cattle are causing global warming and that stuff. Well, it doesn't make sense because we have less cattle now than we did 30 or 40 years ago, and the climate change has gotten worse. So it makes no sense to say that. But as far as, we can support more cattle than we currently do in the United States and other parts of the world, just with efficiencies and just with the land we have. And so we could probably double our meat production without any more room being utilized, just by improving efficiency measures, again, breeding, nutrition, so on and so forth, feed way more people more meat, and, again, improve the population health. And then you can do it in a regenerative fashion in many cases where it's accepted, where the climate allows for it, and using vertical stacked enterprise where you have cows and pigs and chickens and sheep all on the same paddock, and dramatically improve the productivity of the land and the output. And so we could actually feed a lot more people if we had the will to do that.
Well, it's so encouraging, just to finish off, Shawn, that you're not only thinking of Revero Health and just generally in your outlook and expertise in this really important area. You're not just thinking about the nutritional and the well-being benefits, but you've got your eye on, the wider picture in terms of the environment and animal welfare. So credit to you for that, sir. Shawn, thank you so much for your company. I've really enjoyed talking to you. As I said, I'm a great admirer of your work. My very best wishes for this really important work you're doing with Revero Health, with your life as well. All the very best to you and yours. And thanks for joining us on Success Won't Come Calling. Cheers, Shawn Baker.
Thank you for that. That was very, very, very nice.